Hello and welcome to Bookish avec moi. So this is where I'll be talking about my bookish life of the week. This is kind of akin to Friday reads that a lot of booktubers do, except that I can't really do a Friday read because Friday does not work for me. So I end up doing something like a Sunday reads. So yeah, or Saturday reads because I'm recording this on a Saturday. But anyway, what happened this week? I DNF'd 2 books and I finished 3 books. Like, can you believe that? I am the sluggish reader and yet I finished 3 books. Crazy. In fact, I was expecting to finish 4 books, but then one of those books ended up becoming a DNF. So yeah, 2 DNF and 3 books finished. And I'm gonna talk about the DNF books first. So the first book that I DNF'd earlier last week was the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. I actually took about 2 weeks to kind of trying reading this book, and at the beginning this book kind of started out quite strong. This book is about this housewife who lives in the American South in a suburban neighborhood. The story takes place in the 80s and 90s. And this housewife, her name is Patricia. She finds that her life is very dull, very boring, and she just wants something that is exciting. And so she joins a book club whose members is actually other housewives in that neighborhood. And then one day there is a strange person moving into the neighborhood. He's a white guy with a white van, and of course we know everyone who has a white van are suspicious. And strange things started to happen in that place. Patricia's ear got bitten off, and there was also rat attack. And then she just got kind of curious as to how these things are happening. Back to her motivation, she kind of has this desire to have something more adventurous in her life. And so I guess that kind of one of the things that pushed her to go into this investigative mode, and she starts to investigate what exactly is going on in the neighborhood, and that kind of leads her to another neighborhood with mostly black members of the neighborhood. And more weird things happen in that other neighborhood instead. And I didn't really continue much after that because I thought that once Patricia got into this investigative mood, the book started to feel boring. The reason why I thought that the book was quite strong at the beginning was because I really liked the fact that we have this housewife character who is kind of disgruntled and she wants more, and everyone wants that kind of character and everyone wants to hear that character's story. But then afterwards, I guess that once Patricia becomes an amateur investigator, her character just becomes a little bit dull. Like maybe she is quite excited to know more about what's going on in with the strange things that are happening in the neighborhood, but I definitely do not want to stay with her. And also there's this kind of it's mild, and I'm not sure how it is going to change if I were to stay in this book. But there's this also like very light element of white savior in this book, like Patricia being white, and the other neighborhood that I said, whose inhabitants are mostly the black people. More weird things like people disappearing, people dying over there happening in that neighborhood. And here is Patricia, who is kind of like a white middle class person coming to the rescue. It just sounds a little bit weird. So this book just turned kind of boring for me, and I couldn't really feel it, so I stopped reading it. Now the next book that I DNF'd was, for maybe Midrash, this is Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. This edition that I have is translated by Hilda Rosner from the German into the English. And this book, I think it was published originally in the 1920s. And there is this like really big misconception that I had about this book, which was something that I said also in the past videos, and that is I thought that this book was going to be about, you know, this biographical novel about the Buddha and his journey towards spiritual enlightenment. And yeah, that's what I thought, and I was really embarrassed by that mistake. And then when I went to Goodreads and I saw many reviews also admitted to having that misconception, and I was not embarrassed anymore. Turns out that was in fact a mistake that many people experience as well, not just me, so I don't feel as stupid. Anyway, so what is this book about instead? This book is actually about this random guy named Siddhartha, and he lives around the time of Siddhartha Gautama also, who is actually the founder of Buddhism, and he does in fact meet Siddhartha Gautama sometime later in the book. But yeah, this book is not about the founder of Buddhism, but just about this random protagonist named Siddhartha, who is of the Brahmin caste, and this book is about his kind of his own quest, his own personal journey towards enlightenment. So at least that part I kind of got right. But yeah, this book is just about some random person, and I thought, well, now that I knew it, that that it was different, I thought it was kind of it was going to be interesting. It's not going to be this biography of some well-known figure. It's just going to be like a novel about some person, and I thought, whoa, that's nice. And so I started reading this one. It started quite nice, and then it kind of dwindled afterwards. And mind you, the chapters were very short. The pace is fairly fast. It's not that fast, it's kind of like medium pace, and I was able to read a few chapters in a short burst, but really it became boring after that. One of the things that I found really difficult to accept, something that really prevented me from enjoying this book, is the amount of Asian or Eastern mysticism in this book, or at least the constant bombardment of exotic image that I have in my eyes. And I am Asian myself, and I can't help but see everything in this book just looks so exotic, and it's like, it was kind of strange to see, even though I've never really been to India myself, and this book actually takes place in a different period, different era of India, but still there is this strong sense of foreignness, this strong sense of exoticness in this book, which I thought was kind of difficult to enjoy, difficult to accept. Now, this book was published in the 1920s, I think, and so maybe it makes sense that there was not really like kind of awareness when it comes to those kinds of things back then. I'm not sure how much research Hesse did on the source material regarding India and Buddhism when he was writing this book. I am not familiar with Hesse's body of work in general. This is my first book by Hesse, and so, but then Hesse is kind of like a really, really big name in literature, especially German literature, and I thought, well, maybe this book would look nice. But yeah, I think there's also another thing that kind of contributed to how this exoticness became really jarring, and that is, I think, one, this book was kind of written in this allegorical style. It is supposed to be kind of like an allegorical novel about a person's quest for enlightenment. So with allegorical novel, or something that resembles allegory, typically it's going to be short. It is going to focus mostly on the main character, and everything else is just kind of treated almost haphazardly or with less detail compared to the main character. We're not supposed to kind of like focus on everything else beyond the main character, or something in a close proximity to the main character. And so as a result, everything else just seemed strange. It seemed like it was not explored deeply enough. Everything else was just kind of glossed over superficially. And I think maybe that's why the exoticness is accidentally or unintentionally highlighted in this book. And another thing was, this book is kind of written in the style that is supposedly resemble a poem. So it has this kind of like poetic characteristic to it. It is not something that supposed to kind of read like a normal prose. Like the dialogues just do not resemble how people generally speak, because many people speak in third person, and here it's strange. I mean, if you live in Malaysia, some people do speak in third person, but it is still strange. But yeah, and I think that also highlights how exotic the setting is in this book. So I just really couldn't enjoy this one very much. I'm not sure maybe if I were to go back to this one. I'm still interested in Hermann Hesse's work. Steppenwolf comes to mind, because that's also very, very famous, so I would like to try that soon. But I think for Siddhartha, I am going to just kind of drop it for now. Not gonna read it. I don't like it. So yeah, those are my two DNFs. I think I talk a lot about my two DNFs. So I'm gonna talk about my finished books next. The first book that I finished this past week was Carol by Patricia Highsmith. Now this book was originally published as The Price of Salt in the 1950s under the pseudonym Claire Morgan. Patricia Highsmith, she is also kind of well known for other novels like the Mr. Ripley series, which I'm definitely quite interested to read, because apparently those books are kind of different than Carol. It does have somewhat of a queer character, I think, also. But Carol seems to be kind of a novel that treats the queer character in a much different light. From what I hear and from what I read, people saying about those comparisons. Anyway, I really, really enjoyed this book. I think that this is kind of like one of those quiet books that you can read while you're relaxing, while you're at a hotel somewhere alone, or at a cottage somewhere, or when you're on a vacation or road trip. This book is just perfect because it has all of that quiet, romantic feel to it. Now, Carol is about this main character whose name is Therese Bellivet. She lives in New York and she works at a department store selling toys. And so one day, while she is working, this older woman who is somewhat 20 years older than her. Her name is Carol. Carol comes to the store and she wants to buy some toys for her daughter, and she meets Therese and they kind of flirted with one another, and somehow after Carol buys her stuff and then leaves, Therese sends her a note, and then things just kind of started from there. Their relationship just kind of started from there. Now things kind of got somewhat complicated because Carol, at that time, she is a married woman, but she's in the process of getting a divorce, and she is kind of battling for custody over for her daughter with her husband, and at the same time, she is also kind of juggling her new relationship with Therese, and I must say that this book is, in fact, a love story, kind of like a romance, but not a traditional romance. And the second half of this book turns into a road trip story where Carol just invites Therese to go on a road trip with her, and that is where they kind of explore more of their relationship, and some wild things happen in the road trip which I'm not going to talk about with you. While I was reading this novel, I also kind of just looked at some clips on YouTube about of the movie adaptation of this novel, which was made in 2015, I think. And I thought that the clips were so beautiful. It really complemented my reading experience of this book, the way that the characters talk, and I just automatically imagine that's how the characters talk in here. And Carol is played by Cate Blanchett, and she just have this like strong charisma, and instantly it was kind of like, yeah, that makes sense. That's how Carol talk, and that's literally how I imagine Carol talk in this book, from the beginning to the end. Now, another thing about this book is that it is also kind of like a coming-of-age story, especially for the character Therese. She is a young woman, probably she's just 20 years old, or 19 if I'm not mistaken, and this book kind of sees her growing, maturing over the course of her relationship with Carol. And I think that is kind of like the nice part also in this book, because you get to see Therese just pretty much blossoms into a different person, just kind of undergoes this change in maturity. And to a certain extent, you can also say that this is also a coming of age-ish story for the older character Carol. And so yeah, this book is abound with character development, which is something that I really, really love, if you do not know that by now. And if you love character developments, if you love a lovely lesbian romance love story, which happens to contain flawed characters, if you like a road trip story, if you like the combination of all of these things, do try this book. I really, really love it. It's a lovely, lovely book. Next, I also finished The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This book was a buddy read with Jyotsna of Jyotsna's Bookscapades. This is one of my most anticipated reads this year, because I've heard so many people talking about this book and how it made them cry, and I really, really wanted to experience that, becoming so emotional that you end up crying while reading a book. Now, this book, by the time I finished it, I didn't cry, which shouldn't surprise anybody, because somehow I find it really difficult to cry. But I'm going to talk about that crying after that, after this book. But anyway, back to this book. The Song of Achilles is a kind of like a myth retelling that concerns the story of Achilles and his relationship with Patroclus. And what's interesting about this book is that it is written from the point of view of Patroclus, who is Achilles' best friend, or beloved. And we see how their relationship just kind of blossoms from the beginning while they were young kids, all the way until the end, when Achilles has to participate in the battle to get Helen back from Troy. I found that overall it was just a nice, cute novel that explores their romance, love story. It's nice, it's okay. But what I found that, something that bugged me a little bit is that Patroclus in this book, because he's the narrator, he is so fleshed out, which is a good thing. It is a good thing. And I feel that characters other than Patroclus, like, Achilles, who is kind of like the second character, and also all the other characters, the side characters, are not as fleshed out as Patroclus. In fact, I feel that Achilles is just kind of like an image there, someone who happens to be Patroclus's lover, best friend, someone who is the best of the Greeks, so called. And we definitely get to see that, how Achilles is like this really awesome person who is like he's very good at fighting, he's very good looking, he's very good at everything. And but I guess it was mostly tell and not show, and I just didn't feel so much of that human quality when it comes to other characters aside from Patroclus. And don't get me started on the side characters as well. They were treated just simply like side characters, side characters literally getting sidelined. It didn't feel enough. Like when I finished this book, I wanted something more. I wanted a much more filling experience, and I felt that there was something lacking in this book. I was kind of disappointed because I really had a big expectation on this one. But anyway, I finally finished this. It didn't make me cry, so yeah. But the third book that I finished did kind of make me feel very, very, very emotional, and that is The Weight of Our Sky by Hanna Alkaf. So this book is actually one of the books that caught my attention last year. Even though it's a YA seldom catches my attention, and I do want to try more and more YA fiction. And this one, the reason why it caught my attention was because this is a YA fiction that sets during the May 13 incident in the history of Malaysia, which, if you are not really familiar, the May 13 incident is actually a very, very controversial. It's super, super politically charged. It is filled with so much racial sentiment, and it is one of those events. It is one of those historical incidents that whose effects it is still felt today. And also, just as a side note, one of the aftermath of this incident, one of the things that the government of Malaysia introduced was this thing called New Economic Policy, and essentially that policy just kind of introduced a different kind of worms in Malaysian society as a whole. Essentially, it's kind of like an affirmative action policy that drives, the purpose is to supposedly to bridge the gap between the economical gap between different racial groups in Malaysia. But that policy is still being practiced today, and it is quite controversial actually, and you can Google more about that. But let me just say that event just kind of introduced more complicated things into the society fabric of Malaysia. And there's a YA sets during that period, so that's going to be really interesting. And yes, indeed, it was really, really interesting. I really enjoyed this book. And another thing that was kind of special about this one is that this book features a character who has to deal with OCD. And the way that she experiences OCD is also very interesting, given the fact that this character, her name is Malati. Because the time when she lives, it's the 60s, and so there's not much knowledge, public knowledge, when it comes to mental health, and she thinks that her OCD is caused by the jinn who is playing with her mind. And throughout this novel, this condition was never named at all. It was never termed OCD, which makes sense because no one would have known to call it OCD. But it was really obvious that she has OCD and it's really affecting her. And essentially what happens in this book is that Malati, she goes out with her friend to watch a movie at the cinema at the beginning of this book. But while they were watching the movie, without them knowing, there was this violent riot that happened outside of the cinema in the streets of Kuala Lumpur. And just for background, this violent riot, which was the May 13 incident, it actually happened after this kind of contentious election result came out, where the opposition won the election, and people were like fighting with one another. The Chinese and Malay were fighting with one another, and Malati and her friend was kind of trapped in this cinema. And then there is someone who came into the cinema a Chinese guy, and he kind of separates the cinema goers into Malays and non-Malays. Malati, because she has a rather fair skin, she leaves the cinema with other non-Malays, and the Malays, and including her friend, has to stay in the cinema. And after that, Malati just kind of has to find her way back home while trying to just kind of navigating all of the violence that is happening in the streets of Kuala Lumpur at the time. And during this period, she is also staying with a Chinese family who shelters her during the entire ordeal. And her OCD really manifests in the way that if she doesn't count in threes, then something inside her, kind of like a voice inside her, will tell her that her family, her mother, her friends, everyone around her would die. And it is especially vivid when it comes to her mom, because this voice keeps on threatening her that if she doesn't really do what it says, if she doesn't really follow her OCD tendency to count in threes, then her mother would definitely die. And with all of the violence that is happening outside in the streets, it definitely exacerbates her mental condition, which made it even more, I would say, really, really strongly portrayed. So I really enjoyed reading this book, even though it is simply written. The language is just simple. It's not trying to be like super flowery, but the emotions in this book is just so strong. And I think probably also because it's kind of close to home as well. But in general, I think that this book is very well written. So even if you're not a fan of YA fiction, I strongly recommend you to read this one, because it's just really good. And it's a really good book, a YA, combined with some weird, wild, not weird, but really wild, really political, really controversial event in Malaysian history. So it's a nice combination, interesting combination, which I never would have imagined. But yeah, this is a good book. So those are all of the books that I read this past week. Now onto the books that I'm currently reading quickly. Also includes books that I might or might not read next week. I'm certainly reading this book still, I Know This Much Is True, by Wally Lam. I am also reading this family fiction, domestic fiction, by Jane Smiley. It's called Some Luck. As for maybe Midrash, IDNF Siddhartha. So I began with this book, Jim Crace, quarantine. I'm still at the beginning, only 2 chapters in so far. And then I might read more of this one also by Shih-Li, a Malaysian author. This is her short story collection. It's called Ripples and Other Stories. I am also reading another short story collection by a Malaysian author, by Ho Sok Fong, and the title is Lake Like a Mirror. This book was originally written in Chinese and it was translated into the English by Natascha. So what do I expect to read? Other books. Next week I am going to start a buddy read with Sean of Sean the Book Maniac. This is Not a Virgin by Nuril Basri. This book was originally written in Indonesian, and this was translated into the English by John H. McGlynn. So this book is about it's kind of like a tragic comedy, based on what the blurb says at the back. There will be 4 characters, and they are going to have to handle things like sexuality, love, religion, and drugs. I think this is going to be kind of like a queer novel of sorts, so I'm really interested to see how that is like. Anyway, that's it for my Bookish avec moi this week, and I'll see you again in a different video. So until then, take care, thanks for watching, and bye.